The radio crackled to life. We found him. Alive. A stunned silence swept through the rescue base camp. It was early February 1992, deep in a snowbound valley north of Kathmandu. After more than 40 days of searching, a voice finally broke through the static, confirming the impossible. A man had survived. His name was James Scott, a 22-year-old medical student from Australia. In December 1991, while completing a hospital elective in Nepal, he used a short break to hike into the Himalayas. He was lightly equipped, confident after a smooth autumn trek just months before. But that success would blind him to the brutal reality of a Himalayan winter. When the storm hit, blinding snow, vanished trails, he chose the only direction left: upward. There, he found a narrow rock overhang for shelter. No fire, no food, only a sleeping bag, his clothes, and what he remembered from medical school. He used that knowledge, drying every inch of his body to fight hypothermia, staying still to conserve energy. Discipline from years of karate training helped him focus, one small survival decision at a time. He ate snow for water. He waited. And he endured. Far below, two searches began. A professional mountaineering team calculated likely routes and weather windows. At the same time, James's sister Joanne sought help from a local Buddhist lama who pointed to a triangle on the map and said, "Look here." Two entirely different paths, science and faith, slowly began to converge. Then, one day, a helicopter's rotor echoed through the valley. Somewhere in that frozen wilderness, a starving man waved a sleeping bag above his head and exposed bright red long johns to be seen. The aircraft circled, vanished, and hours later, a ground team began the climb. After 43 days in one of the deadliest regions of the Himalayas, James Scott was still alive. This is not a story of recklessness or luck. It's a story of small choices that kept a man breathing, and of the people whose courage and conviction turned an impossible survival into a living memory. In the months before that winter, James Scott had been living what most would call a perfect life. He was in his final year of medical school in Australia, earning top marks and preparing for a hospital placement overseas. Nepal seemed like the perfect choice: remote, challenging, and in need of doctors. He wanted to make a difference, and the Himalayas felt like the right place to start. When his application to a Kathmandu hospital was finally accepted, James felt unstoppable. At 22, he had everything in front of him: his degree, his fiancée waiting back home, and an adventure that promised purpose. He arrived in Nepal that September, joined by his close friend Tim Hooper. The plan was simple: settle in, meet the doctors, and get a feel for the country before his placement began. But life in Kathmandu was unlike anything he'd imagined. The city was a swirl of noise, prayer flags, and mountain air. Everywhere he looked, there were trekkers, people chasing something beyond comfort, beyond reason. And soon, James would be one of them. He wasn't a thrill seeker, but he loved to stay active. Back home, he hiked nearly every week and held a black belt in karate. He wasn't reckless, just confident. So when local doctors suggested he explore the nearby trails before his hospital work began, he agreed without hesitation. That first trek was everything he'd hoped for. He and Tim hiked through forests and cliffs, reaching peaks that looked like the edge of the world. It was difficult, but manageable. They returned to Kathmandu tired, proud, and hungry for more. And that success planted the seed for what would come next. Second trek, deeper into the Himalayas, planned for December, a time of snow, wind, and storms. A time when the mountains no longer welcomed visitors. As December approached, the air in Kathmandu turned colder, thinner, and still. The monsoon season was long gone, leaving behind clear skies and a deceptive calm. To James and Tim, it felt like the perfect moment to set out again. One last adventure before James began his hospital rotation. Their first hike had gone so smoothly that preparation this time felt almost unnecessary. They packed light: rucksacks, sleeping bags, a few layers of clothes, and some snacks. Compared to the heavy gear other trekkers carried, they felt almost carefree. They told themselves experience was enough. On December 21st, they left the city and began the trek toward the Langtang region, a route that wound through deep forests, narrow ridges, and small villages scattered along the slopes. At the first lodge, they met a group of German hikers returning from the mountains. The Germans told them the trails were clear, the weather mild, and the journey simple. No snow, no danger, just long days and cold nights. It was exactly what James wanted to hear. But the Germans also handed over something that would change everything: a newer, more detailed map. James took it, grateful, not realizing how crucial it would become. The old map he'd brought from home was outdated and missing several trails, including one that led into the more remote valleys north of the main route. The next morning, they met another hiker, a fellow Australian named Mark Fulton. He was traveling alone, soft-spoken but determined, and when James and Tim invited him to join, he quickly agreed. For a while, the three of them moved together, trading stories, sharing food, and enjoying the climb. Then, without warning, Tim twisted his leg on a rocky slope. The pain was sharp, deep enough to stop him in his tracks. He knew he couldn't go on. At the next junction, he told James he was turning back to Kathmandu. James hesitated. He could have returned with him, but Tim insisted. He told him to continue with Mark and finish the trek. They agreed to meet again on Christmas Eve for dinner back in the city. Before they parted, Tim asked for a copy of the map. Without thinking, James handed him the new one, the detailed map from the Germans. He didn't realize his mistake until it was too late. Now, he and Mark would head deeper into the mountains, guided only by an old, inaccurate map. And ahead of them waited the first storm of the Himalayan winter. The morning after Tim turned back, the mountains felt emptier. James and Mark pressed forward, following the faint trail that wound higher into the clouds. The air grew thinner, colder, sharper with each step. They spoke less, saving their energy for the climb. By midday, the path split into two. One led toward the familiar Langtang route, the other toward an unmarked trail that curved deeper into the highlands. Their outdated map offered little help. Still, they remembered what the German hikers had said: no snow, easy passage. So they took the lesser-known route, confident they could handle whatever lay ahead. That confidence didn't last. By afternoon, clouds began to form over the ridgelines, thick and heavy. The light shifted, and the wind picked up. When the first flakes fell, James didn't worry. He'd seen snow before. Beautiful, harmless, even peaceful. But this wasn't that kind of snow. Within an hour, the trail vanished beneath white. Visibility dropped to a few meters, and the world turned silent. James shouted for Mark, but the wind swallowed his voice. Then, through the swirling snow, he realized they were no longer on the same side of the stream. Somehow, they'd been separated by the current and a wall of fog. It took 15 minutes of shouting before they found each other again. When they did, James urged that they turn back to the lodge they'd left that morning. But Mark was certain he could navigate by instinct. He believed the trail would reconnect ahead, leading them back toward Kathmandu. After a brief argument, the two men made a fateful decision. Mark would continue forward, and James would return the way they came. James turned alone into the storm. He tried to follow their footprints, but the snow was falling too fast. Within minutes, the trail had vanished. He walked in circles, searching for landmarks, but there were none. Only white, stretching endlessly in every direction. That was when the truth hit him. He wasn't retracing his steps. He was lost in the Himalayas. He decided to follow a nearby creek, hoping it would lead to a village below. But after hours of trudging through waist-deep snow, the valley narrowed, the walls rising higher until they closed into a sheer rock face. Ahead of him, the creek dropped away into a waterfall, 30 meters straight down. There was no going forward, and the thought of turning back into that storm felt impossible. So he looked up. The cliff was steep, slick, and deadly, but it was the only direction left. And in that moment, exhausted and freezing, James Scott began to climb. The climb was brutal. Each ledge he reached was slick with ice, his fingers raw and bleeding from the cold. Several times he slipped, catching himself only by instinct. Every muscle screamed, but the fear of freezing to death below pushed him higher. After 2 hours of clawing his way upward, James finally reached the top, a small rocky shelf beneath an overhang, just large enough to crawl under. He collapsed, shaking uncontrollably. His clothes were soaked through, his hands numb, and his heartbeat slow. It was the first time he truly understood how close he was to dying. Remembering his medical training, James forced himself to strip off his wet clothes and dry his skin with a towel he had packed. It went against every instinct, but he knew staying wet meant certain death. He crawled into his sleeping bag, pulling it tight over his head. The wind screamed outside the rock ledge, a constant roar that made it impossible to tell night from day. There, in total darkness, James began the fight for his life. When dawn came, he tried to move again. The snow was deeper now, so deep he could barely lift his legs. He followed another small creek, hoping it might lead out of the mountains, but progress was agonizingly slow. After 2 hours, he'd moved less than a kilometer. The steep banks were slick with ice, and each attempt to climb them ended in a fall. By late afternoon, he found another overhang and decided to stop. He was exhausted, shaking, and his feet had gone completely numb. That night, the cold was worse. He couldn't sleep. At one point, he was so sure he would die that he took out a notebook and began writing a letter to his family. He apologized for being foolish, for making them worry, for everything they would soon have to endure. When he finished, he tucked the note into his pack and lay back down beneath the overhang, listening to the wind carve through the valley, waiting for morning, if morning would ever come. Days blurred together. The sun no longer rose or set. It simply faded in and out through the clouds. James stopped counting time and focused on the only thing that mattered: staying alive. He rationed his strength, stayed inside the rock shelter, and ate handfuls of snow to stay hydrated. There was no food, no fire, and no sign of anyone nearby. His body weakened, but his mind refused to give in. After nearly 2 weeks, the hunger faded. It wasn't gone, it simply stopped hurting. His stomach had given up, his thoughts slow and hazy. To keep his mind sharp, he turned to what he knew best: discipline. He closed his eyes and ran through karate routines, imagining each movement, each breath, as though he were training instead of dying. It gave him something to hold on to, a rhythm in the chaos. But the human body has limits. When he finally looked at his feet, they were blue and lifeless. He pulled out a small medical kit, took the dissection scissors, and stabbed them into the side of his foot. Blood appeared, bright against the white snow, but he felt nothing. He knew then he might lose both feet, if he lived long enough for that to matter. One afternoon, as he lay half asleep, a deep guttural roar shattered the silence. He froze. From above the slope came a violent rustling, and then a shadow, massive, black, moving. A Himalayan black bear. It had caught his scent. James grabbed the scissors, his only weapon. He screamed at the bear, daring it to come closer. For a second, he almost wanted it to. A quick end instead of slow suffering. But the bear turned and vanished into the trees. For the next 5 nights, he heard it circling nearby. Every sound in the dark felt like the end. Meanwhile, far below in Australia, his family was starting to panic. When James missed his Christmas Eve dinner, his friend Tim sent a message home. James was missing in the Himalayas. His sister Joanne immediately contacted the Australian government. a mountaineering expert in Kathmandu, Carl Harrison, was hired to lead a search team. Helicopters combed the valleys, rescue groups hiked through blizzards, but the mountains swallowed every clue. Days passed, then weeks, and still no sign of James. Until a report came in from a group of Canadian trekkers. They had seen a lone man moving slowly through the snow. They were almost certain it was him. For the first time, hope returned. By the time the new year arrived, James had been missing for more than 2 weeks. Joanne couldn't wait any longer. She boarded a plane to Nepal, determined to find her brother herself. When she landed in Kathmandu, search teams were already combing the highlands, but blizzards kept grounding helicopters, and rescuers often lost their way in the maze of valleys. Every day, Joanne waited by the radio, hoping to hear a single word, found. But all she heard was static. Then she remembered a conversation from the airport. A local woman had told her, "If you truly want to find him, speak to a lama." At first, Joanne dismissed it, but with no progress and no hope left, she decided to try. The lama listened quietly as Joanne showed him a map. He closed his eyes, prayed, and after a long silence, pointed to a small triangular area formed by 3 villages, Gopte, Tolu, and Gosaikunda. "This is where he is," he said. When Joanne asked if her brother was alive, the lama smiled softly. "You will see him again." It sounded impossible. Mountain experts said the terrain there was impassable, that no route existed to reach it. But Joanne passed the coordinates to the rescue team anyway. What did they have to lose? Meanwhile, high above that very triangle, James was barely conscious. He had stopped trying to move. The snow had become his bed, the rock his ceiling, and silence his only company. Then, one morning, a low rumble echoed across the valley. At first he thought it was the wind, but the sound grew louder, steady, mechanical, familiar. A helicopter. James crawled out of his shelter, dragging his sleeping bag behind him. He waved it in the air, then dropped his pants to reveal his bright red long johns, a desperate flash of color against the white. The chopper circled once, twice, then turned and vanished. The silence returned. James collapsed in the snow, sure he'd been seen, but also certain he wouldn't last until help arrived. He whispered to himself, "Just one more day. Hold on one more day." 4 days later, he heard footsteps crunching in the snow. At first he thought he was dreaming, but then came voices. Real, human voices. "Are you James Scott from Australia?" one of them shouted. He lifted his head, blinking against the light. "Yes," he managed to whisper. The rescuers dropped to their knees, hugging him, crying, laughing all at once. One of them said, "You're a god, James." No one survives here for more than 10 days. James had survived 43. He was airlifted out the next morning, emaciated but alive. The coordinates of his rescue, exactly within the triangle the lama had drawn on the map. To some, it was luck. To others, fate. But to James, it was simply the will to live. When the helicopter touched down in Kathmandu, a thin, pale man stepped out, barely able to stand. His sister ran toward him, tears freezing on her face. For a long moment, they just held each other, both too overwhelmed to speak. Years later, Joanne would recall that moment in an interview.
"I'm Joanne Robertson. 30 years ago, my younger brother James Scott went missing in the Nepalese Himalayas. He would be lost for a total of 42 days. Still, I knew that the only thing worse than finding a body would be to never know what had happened to James. My family was putting the weight of their expectations upon me to try and do everything I could. And I was determined that I was not going to leave any stone unturned. No matter how bizarre the concept, no matter how illogical or unscientific it might be, I needed to know in a decade's time, regardless of the outcome, that I had done absolutely everything I could to try and locate James or his body. It had to be somewhere. Looking back, I think what I took away from the whole experience was the power of persistence, to be prepared to do whatever it takes, to try and stay strong, to follow your heart and follow your gut, do what you think is the right thing. I mean, we're just very ordinary people put into an extraordinary circumstance, and we had a truly amazing result. The stars aligned, but both James particularly and I worked very hard to get the result, the amazing result that we got.
James was immediately taken to a hospital where doctors said his survival was almost beyond medical explanation. Severe frostbite, dehydration, starvation, and yet his organs were still functioning. It was as if his body had slowed itself down just enough to keep him alive. Over the next weeks, he learned to walk again. His feet, though scarred, healed better than expected. And slowly, the story spread. First through Kathmandu, then across the world. A young man who had survived 43 days alone in the Himalayas. No food, no fire, no map, only endurance. Reporters called it a miracle. James called it discipline and luck. He thanked the rescuers, the search teams, and his sister, who had never stopped believing. When asked about the lama, he simply smiled and said, "Whatever guided them to that place, I'm just grateful it did." In the years that followed, James returned to medicine, earning his degree and building a quiet life back in Australia. He rarely spoke about those 6 weeks in the mountains, but when he did, he described it not as a story of adventure, but of awareness. The moment when every heartbeat, every breath became a choice between panic and patience. Decades later, in interviews, his voice still carried the calm of that mountain. He said survival wasn't about strength, it was about acceptance, the ability to face fear and to stay still when every instinct tells you to run. In the end, the mountains gave him nothing, no comfort, no answers, but they taught him everything about being alive. James Scott's story is more than a survival tale. It's a reminder of how far the human mind can go when pushed to its limits. He faced the impossible and made it through, not because of strength, but because he refused to give up. If you'd like to see more real stories like this one, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.